We're going to be talking about Shemittah. Shemittah is a mitzvah, a very significant mitzvah, because in the Torah itself, we are told that when they are exiled from the land of Israel due to their sins, the land could finally rest, which is a strong indication that the resting of the land is a significant one. And just as we quite often identify the observance of a Jew as a Shomer Shabbos, Shomer Shabbos is a declaration that I have one day a week that I rest, and it is one day a week that really gives meaning to the rest of the week. Observing Shemittah is 1 year out of 7, but it gives meaning to all other 6 years as well. A very significant mitzvah for us Jews. The Torah teaches it. The Torah tells us it is a time that you recognize that everything is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is a time that you realize that what is yours, but it should be used in the proper way for the sake of others. That's what Shemittah is about. We read, we are inspired by that section of Torah. So we are discussing Shemittah. We're going to be discussing some controversies, some fascinating controversies that occurred in the 16th century, 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. But let's not forget how lucky we are to observe and study these halachos lema'aseh. I have no doubt that our ancestors 170 years ago, 270 years ago, 370 years ago, are extremely jealous of us because we are seeing the land of Israel coming to life with the tsaras and with the yisurim. Some awful things occur in Israel. The brutality of some of the Palestinians. The lack of responsibility that all the Palestinians have, because if you are in a society that has some corrupt people, it is your responsibility to uproot them. The silence that is taking place. Where are the members of those neighborhoods coming out to the streets and yelling, "Let's stop it! We're not going to have jobs. This is ruining." I have not heard it. I don't know, maybe you have. Right, a protest in Silwan, in what was the neighborhood that these chayes came from? Jabal Makbar, whatever it was. Did you see any protests there? Let's stop it. It's time to change. This behavior is unacceptable.
They're scared.
They're scared. So in other words, as a society, there's corruption there. There is corruption, and this is something that collectively they are to blame. There's no nice way to put it. We try very hard. Islam is really a religion of peace. It's corrupted. We try very, very hard doing it, and we're going to continue our best. But let's face the reality. The sheker of the media, we are suffering. It eats us up alive. The worst thing to do after such an attack is to turn on the TV or the internet, and we all do it anyway, right? Because we just get agitated and more agitated. The Rishoim in CNN, right? The Rishoim. And it is not insignificant, because that changes the way the world views it. And I'm not going to even start about the statement that came from the White House. If you analyze it, it's sickening. We won't go there. There's Yisurim, there are terrible things happening, but look at the big picture. Let's face it. Klal Yisrael has been suffering for 2,000 years. We, Baruch Hashem, are meriting to see the beginning of different things. We are, take your own age, okay? I'm not going to ask you your age. Take your own age. Take the day you were born and think of the amount of Jews that lived in Eretz Yisrael then. Okay?
Three.
I'll tell you, I'm not going to spell out your age, but it was about 500,000 perhaps. Okay? And Baruch Hashem, we have multiplied it by 12. Right? And we view every Jew settling in that land that is an achievement. We are living in a period of achievements, of Jewish achievements. And therefore these halachos, these controversies, right, they are interesting, they're fascinating, but let's celebrate it. It is really a celebration. So let's take that into consideration as we discuss and analyze a topic that is quite fascinating. And we're going to begin our discussion in 1910 in a small German community by the name of Schwabach. Schwabach. Sounds German? German enough? And the Rov in Schwabach opens his mail. The local rabbi in Schwabach opens his mail, not his email, his mail. And he looks, and there's a letter from Eretz Israel, from Yerushalayim. And the Rov of Schwabach looks for a return address, and it is from Rabbi Yaakov David Milevsky, Hamechuneh, who calls himself Rabbi Yaakov David, right? Milevsky, the Ridvaz. Ridvaz, that's how he calls himself. Okay? And Ridvaz sends his letter to many rabbis in many communities throughout Europe, and among them to Rab Shlomo HaKohen Manes in Schwabach. Okay? Now, it is significant for me because Rab Shlomo HaKohen Manes is my great-grandfather. Okay? And my great-grandfather receives a letter from Ridvaz. What did Ridvaz want from my grandfather? That's the question. Okay, that's going to be the question we're going to get to at some point. What does Ridvaz want from my grandfather? Fine. Now, Shemittah is linked to another wonderful mitzvah, the mitzvah of Yovel. You count 7 cycles, you reach the Jubilee. Jubilee is an incredible year. Dror lecholar, it's a time of freedom. You happen to be a slave, a Jewish slave, you return to your earlier and prior status. Properties, again, a return of properties. It is a time that you reconnect to your land, reconnect to your roots, reconnect to your freedom. And if you had a privilege of visiting Philadelphia, you could see that etched into the Liberty Bell are the words from the Jubilee. The Jubilee, a very significant mitzvah that unfortunately at one point in our history it ceased. Gamarnu, no longer, Yovel is no longer celebrated. When did Yovel lose its effect? According to Torah law, the day that 2.5 of the tribes of Israel were exiled from their land. Because the rabbis learned, reading into the text of the Torah, they understood that there is only a Jubilee, there is only a Yovel, when you have representatives of all the tribes of Israel in their lands, in their designated territory. When unfortunately tribes were uprooted, were exiled, or were lost, there is no longer a Yovel. This is what the Talmud teaches us. And therefore, towards the end, several decades before the destruction of the first temple, and we talk about the lost 10 tribes, but prior to the 10 being lost, 2.5 of them were exiled. And they were the Shvatim, the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe, who happened to be settled on the east bank of the Jordan River. They are exiled. Jubilee is no longer in effect. That's what the Talmud tells us. So as Ezra returns to rebuild the second Bet HaMikdash, some of the Torah laws of Israel do apply, some do not. And this is what the rabbis tell us, that you should know that when Ezra sanctified the land as he returned, the sanctification it took effect. And in some ways it is more significant, the sanctification of Eretz Israel. And when I talk about sanctification, I mean the mitzvot. Eretz Israel has significance, period. In addition to its natural significance, it has significance that there are mitzvot that are practiced there. The mitzvot that are practiced there need kedushat haaretz, the sanctity of the land. When Yehoshua entered, he sanctified the land and mitzvot started rolling. Trumot, Maslot, Masrot, Yovel, Shemitah. Beautiful. When the nation is exiled, unfortunately, to Babylonia, the Kedusha ceased, the Kedushat HaMitzvot. Ezra returns, and it starts again. And the rabbis tell us that you should know Ezra's sanctification was more significant than the one of Yehoshua, because Ezra's sanctification did not cease. And even after the destruction, Eretz Yisrael remained kadosh. From the day Ezra arrived until today, the mitzvot apply. That's what the Talmud tells us. That's what the Rambam tells us. Okay, now, some mitzvot are only rabbinical due to technical problems. For example, Truma, you go to the land of Israel, you tithe, you give a portion to the Kohen. So, the Talmud notes and the Rambam tells us that you have to have for Truma the majority of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And unfortunately, when Ezra returned, most of the Jews did not come back. And therefore, the majority of the Jews were not in Israel. Truma was only rabbinical. According to many thinkers, there is going to be a point very, very soon, perhaps within the next decade, and perhaps if the Almighty wants sooner, that the majority of Jews are going to be in Eretz Yisrael. An incredible achievement that has not happened in 2,400 years. Think about it, right? If any of you are considering Aliyah, you might be the one. You might be the tipping point. One El Al flight lands, and a tipping point occurs that, according to many, Truma suddenly becomes Torah law. 2,400 years with one landing, right? It could happen. You could be the one, right? All you need to do is make your way, find your way to Eretz Yisrael.
Well, first you have to wait.
First you have to
wait a bit and then fly.
Be the right one. In other words, be the right. You want to be the one. So that's what we are told. Now, Trumot Masrot are rabbinic, but it's not that there's sanctity lacking to the land. Back to Yovel. Yovel, unfortunately, even if all the Jews would have returned in the days of Ezra, Yovel would have not taken hold, because of what problem?
12 tribes.
You did not settle. The 12 tribes are lost, and they're not where they belong. So we have some technical problems with Yovel. The Talmud seems to indicate, according to one opinion, which perhaps is the majority opinion, now listen carefully, that since Yovel is not in existence according to Torah law, Shemitah, which is linked to Yovel, so therefore Shemitah is only rabbinic. This is an opinion mentioned in the Talmud known as the opinion of Rabbi, which perhaps is even the majority opinion, that Shemitah is linked to Yovel. So now, what's interesting to note is as follows. During the Second Temple period, they sanctified the Jubilee rabbinically. So therefore, Shemitah was still in play during the Second Temple period. After the destruction of the Second Temple, when Shemitah is just floating on its own every 7 years with no Yovel at all, not even a rabbinic Yovel, so there's a major question, what's the status? Correct? So there's one reading of the Talmud that Shemitah is only rabbinic. There are those who actually seem to indicate that there are those who believe that it is Torah law. And this will be the most significant debate on this issue. If Shemitah is Torah law, we have to look at it one way. And if Shemitah is only rabbinic, you look at it at a very different way. Okay? So far so good. Keep that information in mind. Due to the fact Jubilee, we all agree, is lost. Shemitah, what's its status? Is it Torah law? Or is it rabbinic? And I'll throw in one other thing. Perhaps it's not even rabbinic. Perhaps it was just a minute that they adopted. We don't know. There's a question about Shemitah. Now, yes?
Why Shemitah is not tied with the 12 tribes?
So that's the question. Yovel is for sure tied. Shemitah, we don't know. So it's a different reading. Different rabbis had a different tradition. Some link it to the 12 tribes. Others say it's an independent mitzvah. It's like Truma, Maaser, where there is absolutely no connection at all to the 12 tribes. Even though there are 10 of them are lost, and even though we are not in our ancestral land, nevertheless, according to some, Shemitah remains Torah law. This is a dispute in the Talmud, okay, between Rabbi and the Chachamim, a very, very significant one, because this will really determine how to deal with the modern problems which began in the year 1889, and we'll get to it very soon. Now,
if Yovel doesn't exist, how do you count Shemitah?
Excellent question. So, when perhaps next class we could, there's a very good question, by the way. Tell you what, it's
My wife
excellent.
just said it was better.
Wow, okay, that's amazing already.
Everyone heard this.
You see, if the rabbi compliments, big deal. But you know, you got everyone.
In the other way around.
What was that?
The Torah discusses it the opposite.
The Torah discusses the opposite because it's Shemitah, then Yovel. Correct. Correct. But the question is it in must to have it as part of its count or not? There's a dispute in the Talmud. What is the Yovel year? In other words, is Yovel year 50, and then the year after that is year 1 of the next Shemitah cycle? Or perhaps Yovel year is actually year 1, and the year after Yovel is year 2 of the cycle. And therefore, due to the two readings, Rambam makes it very clear that after Yovel cease, it is just a cycle. We ignore Yovel completely. We ignore it completely. A major issue, a very significant one, a very good question indeed. So now, we have to remember that we have 0 Ashkenazi traditions regarding mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz. It is very, very fascinating how much of our Ashkenazi practices have to do with minhag. And we have a system. In other words, I study Tosfos, and I study the school of Tosfos, and then I study the Rosh, and then I study the Tur, and then I study the Minhagim, and then I study Isaac Tirna. I could give you a rundown of all Ashkenazi minhagim, not that I know them all, but I can tell you the structure of how we practice our Judaism. And it has to do with the fact that we had traditions in Europe. We picked up some things, perhaps we lost some things, but overall we have a tradition. When it comes to mitzvos that relate to Eretz Yisrael, they had 0 tradition because Eretz Yisrael was a theoretical place. Most of them never visited Eretz Yisrael, right? 99% of them. Aliyah, there was one famous Aliyah movement of the Balei Atosos in the 13th century in the year 1211. And historians are fascinated by it. What great rabbis in the 13th century made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael 1211? Yes, they found documents in the Genisa. We have a record. We know that in Akko there was a yeshiva. But the concept is that Ashkenazi tradition is lacking the tools to deal with mitzvot hatluyot ba'aretz. So how do you go ahead and determine how to tithe, when to tithe, what kind of products? You have to reinvent the wheel, and therefore great rabbinic authorities of the 19th and the 20th century had to do it. Who do they turn to for guidance, right? You're not going to go ahead and turn to the Maharam Rutenberg, because Maharam Rutenberg, right, never tithed olive oil in his life. You have who do you turn to? Who is the authority that we turn to for such issues? It's actually the Rambam. You study the work of Maimonides, the Rambam. So the Rambam becomes extremely significant, even though in general we are told that as Ashkenazim we follow the Rosh and the school of the French and German rabbis. Here the Rambam becomes extremely significant. Now, it is either the divine providence has a sense of humor, or we are just in a funny world, because when the Rambam deals with this issue, he writes something which created tremendous problems. And remember the significance. We must determine if it's Torah law, Shemitah nowadays, or if it's rabbinic. Correct? And I'm telling you it's important. And here, the Rambam tells us the following. You should know. I'm going to read some Rambam. Tune in. Ubizman shahayovel noheg. You should know, when the good old days, when they had a Yovel, there were so many wonderful mitzvos that we had then. For example, Eved Ivri. You wanted a Jewish slave? You want one? I'm sorry. No Yovel, no Jewish slave. Number 2, the laws of Batei Arei Choma, specific laws that relate to walled cities. And there's a whole list of mitzvot that only apply when we have a Yovel. However, nowadays, Bizman she'ena Yovel noheg, eino noeg echad mikol elu. We no longer have it. Chutz, there's an exception. And the exception is mishvi'it ba'aretz. The exception to the rule is Shemitah in Eretz Israel, v'hashmatat ksafim, you know what hashmatat ksafim is? That Shemitah, besides the fact that it releases land from work, it releases debts. And therefore, we're going to be discussing how to get around it, as good Jews, but there is a concept of Shmitat Ksafim. So the Rambam tells us that the exception to the rule, that after Yovel none of them applies, the exception is Shvit Ba'aretz, and Hashmatat Ksafim Bechol Makom, because the law of debts being released, that if I borrow from you today $1,000, correct? And you come back a year later and say, give me the $1,000, and I say, I'm sorry, Shemitah freed me. Now what are you going to do to collect it from me? What are you going to pull out of your pocket? A prusbul, a document that you transferred it to a court. That is Shmitat Ksafim, and it is not just in Eretz Yisrael, it is Bekol Makom. So the Rambam tells us, Medivreihem. Medivreihem meaning that it is rabbinical. So let me read the Rambam, and I'm going to present it in two ways. And you tell me what way you like better. The Rambam is telling us that the exception to the rule that when there's no longer a Yovel, there are no longer any of the mitzvos, the exception is Shvi'it Ba'aretz, Vashmatat Ksafim B'chol Makom Medivreihem. In other words, one way to read it is the Rambam is telling us that the one thing that still remains according to Torah law is Shemitah, and the one thing that remains only rabbinically is the Shmitat Ksafim. Another way to read it is that the exception is Shemitah in Eretz Yisrael and Shmitat Ksafim everywhere, and both of them are rabbinic. So the Rambam leaves us hanging on the most significant issue. And this became an argument we've been arguing for 600 years. What does the Rambam mean? Rav Yosef Karo, in his commentary on Rambam, seems to indicate that Shemitah is not rabbinic, but actually it's Torah law. But the same Rabbi Yosef Karo on his work in Shulchan Aruch seems to indicate that it is rabbinic. This became a topic that is studied in depth, in detail, and therefore we're going to need some guidance. And I'll tell you why it is so important to figure out if we are dealing with Torah law or if it is rabbinic. I'm going to teach you a word that we Jews love using. It's called ha'arama. Ha'arama. What's ha'arama? With an ayin, ha'arama. So I'll translate it to Yiddish. It's shtick. Okay? And the way it works is as follows. I have chametz, right? Pesach. Some of you have whiskey, right? You don't want to spill it out, I assume, right? These things, chas v'shalom, you say. So what do? You sell it to Goy. What are the odds that the guy is going to come ahead and take it from you? Zero, but it is a sale. We call that ha'arama. Okay? You have in your backyard a calf. Your calf is expecting b'shat tovah, but you know that when the young calf is it's the first one that's gonna come out of the womb of that calf. It is a lachor. You have a significant responsibility with that animal, by the way. Because if it is unblemished, it really has sanctity. So what do? You know what you do? You sell the animal to a guy. You work around it. Ha'arama. We Jews use a lot of ha'arama. We have to, right? You gotta survive. It's like the joke of the Orthodox Jew who sold his lungs to a guy so he could smoke. In other words, we have a lot of such stories in our tradition. The general rule is, and again, general rule is, ha'arama works if you're dealing with a rabbinic issue. Ownership of chametz, due to the fact that you nullify it, it's rabbinic. As a general rule, if you're dealing with a rabbinic law, you can tap into the ha'arama system. Torah law, it is far more problematic. So now you realize what we are dealing with when it comes to our Shemitah. You read the Rambam one way, right? You are stuck. No ha'arama if it's Torah law. If you read it another way, what do you have? You have the option of some kind of shtick to get around our issue. So now, this is more of an introduction to the significance of the debate, and it will relate to our question of heter mechira, meaning you are a farmer in Eretz Israel. You have a market that is buying your goods on an annual basis. You turn to them and you say to them, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be supplying you for the next year. I'll see you in a year from now. I'm taking off. Odds are you will lose. You will lose your customers. Correct? So you turn to a rabbinic authority, as many have done over the past century and longer, and they ask the rabbinic authority, can I work out a system? I know on Shabbos there's a concept of selling your business to a non-Jew. Can I go ahead and sell the field, have non-Jews work Torah law prohibitions on the field itself? Can I work out something which, yes, I admit it's a level of ha'arama, can I do it or not? So the rabbi will open up the Rambam and tell you, well, it depends how I read the Rambam. Very, very significant issue. Okay? And that's something we're going to have to address when we get to the year 1889. But we're not there yet. We're going to have to take a little bit of a journey into the 16th century. 16th century Eretz Israel, especially Tzfat, is a great place to visit. Incredible personalities. Tzfat, 16th century. You talk about Arizal, you talk about Rabbi Yosef Karo. The list is very, very long. And I'm going to introduce three individuals that are less known, but they are towers in that period. And the first is a father-son. One of them is Rabbi Moshe Mitrani. There was a great rabbinic family out of Italy from Rabbi Isaiah Mitrani, from Tirani, and he had descendants. They were great luminaries. So we have Rabbi Moshe Mitrani, remember his name, and his son Rabbi Yosef Mitrani, and they live in Tzfat. Father, son live in Tzfat in the days of the Bet Yosef. So we are going to be in Tzfat now, and we're going to be there from, let's say, around the year 1532 to 1575. Okay, so you ready? We're in Tzfat. What was the issue that they would deal with? It is as follows. Jews ate the fruit of the land in Tzfatem. Right? We, for example, know of etrogim that they got from Milevsky. So just as etrogim were supplied by the Arabs who were there, fruits and vegetables were supplied to Tzfat. So if you visit Tzfat at that time, Jews, unfortunately, are not growing their own produce, but the land itself produces, the Arab farmers are selling, and the Jews are buying. Okay? Shemittah, during that period of time. The Arabs come with a big box of vegetables and a big box of fruits. It grew in Eretz Israel during the Shemittah. The Jews buy it. Now comes the question. Do the fruits and vegetables have the sanctity of Shemittah or not? Fruits and vegetables that grew in Eretz Israel, but the owners of the land are Aravim. Does the produce have sanctity or not? So if you were in Tzfat, it all depends who you ask. If you ask one of father or son, either Rabbi Moshe or Rabbi Yosef, they will tell you it has sanctity of Shemitah. And therefore, I'm going to share with you a leniency and a stringency. A leniency that you don't have to tithe the produce of the land, even if it grows by Arabs, if it is put into one cart, and that's considered like the finalizing it as a product, when you purchase it, you have to tithe. But that is only if it is considered one that is, what? If it has no Shemitah. If it is a Shemitah produce, there is absolutely no tithing. So let's repeat that. According to father and son, according to Rabbi Moshe, and according to Rabbi Yosef Mitrani, those carts that I purchase from the Aravim, and the ones that grew during Shemitah have Kedushas, Shvis, have sanctity. The sanctity of Shemitah is not purged by the fact that it is owned by Arabs, and therefore the leniency is that I don't have to tithe, but the stringency is that I have to be aware of Shemitah sanctity when I eat them. you don't throw it out. You land up in Israel and you have Shemittah goods. It's a wonderful thing to eat it, by the way. It's a mitzvah, according to some, to eat it. And logically, it's a tremendous mitzvah because you are connecting to mitzvahs Eretz Yisrael by doing it. However, be aware of the fact you shouldn't be throwing out. If they are goods that are usually not cooked, you're not allowed to cook them. You're not allowed to eat them in an unusual way. There are guidelines. So the Trani father-son would tell people in Tzvat, be careful with them. It has Kedushas Shvis. And when you have peels and leftovers, don't just throw it out. Put it aside until it rots. Then you could throw it out. That was their opinion. Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, disagreed with father-son. He was of the opinion that you should know that it is mufka. It does not have the sanctity of Shemitah. When it is owned by a Gentile, it does not have the sanctity. So therefore, you don't have to worry about the Shemitah aspect. What you do have to do is tithe. And this was the major debate that authorities share, that from the 1530s through the 1570s, every Shemitah, there was a fight. This was the argument in Tzfat. That was the issue that existed then. Fine. Who do you think we would logically follow? Yes, Gary.
Without trying to be too cute, if we believe the land is ours, so the Arabs don't own it, they're just working it. Is that a factor in this issue?
If we believe the land is
ours, even though we weren't living there at the time, we were living there.
Correct. You know, Eretz Yisrael has, even in the spiritual realm, many layers upon layers. There's a layer of Eretz Yisrael that it is the land of the Jews, that it's owned by the Jews, and that's our heritage, period. There's another level, and that is that, unfortunately, throughout history, the Goy has a kinyan. He acquired it, which is a sad thing. There's no question about it. But the real question is when, and this is something the Gemara deals with many times, im yesh kinyan lenochri be'eretz Yisrael lehafkia midei mitzvot or not. And this is what it relates to. And even if you are of the opinion that, yes, they acquire it, like Rabbi Yosef Karo, and yes, unfortunately, the mitzvah of Shemitah no longer applies because of their ownership, it doesn't take away the level of it is still ours. Okay, it's a unique situation, which that's what Eretz Yisrael is about, the uniqueness. Now, this dispute was a very significant dispute year in, year out. Rabbi Yosef Karo in general was followed. But there's a major to-do because there is a claim that in the last year of his life, right, in 1575, Rabbi Yosef Karo changed his mind and became more strict. There was a major dispute. What's interesting to note that the rabbi who shares with us the quote-unquote shift is a rabbi by the name Elazar Askari, who wrote a poem called Yedid Nefesh. Yedid Nefesh, he is the author of Yedid Nefesh, and she shares with us his opinion regarding that issue. Fine, an interesting one to discuss. Another just interesting anecdote that the son, Rabbi Yosef Mitrani, he was born in Eretz Yisrael. He passed away in Turkey. He passed away in Kushta, in Constantine, in Turkey. But there was a tradition by some that after his passing, they brought him to Eretz Tzfat to be buried in Tzfat. So there were two traditions. There was those who believe that he's in Constantinople, and there are those that believe that he's in Eretz Yisrael. In 2008, someone got some funding to do research to find finally his grave. Rabbi Yosef, the Maharit, great rabbinic authority, remember. And he goes and he combs through all the documents of all the cemeteries in Turkey. He found absolutely nothing. So he comes back to Tzfat, and then they happen to be, doing a little bit of construction. If you visit the cemetery in Tzfat, and you want to visit the blue graves are it was a custom in that region to paint graves blue against Ayin Hara. I don't know if it comes from us or not. It doesn't make a difference. So if you get to the location where the great rabbis are buried, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Arizal, so you have to go on a bridge Kohanim don't do it, right? But you have to go on a bridge over many, many graves. So there was construction to build that bridge. So they found there an old matzeva. And experts are able to date the period based on the etchings and based on the cut of the stone. And they look at the date, and it says there that this is a person who died on the 14th of Tammuz in the year Shin Sarites, which would mean 1639, and his name was Yosef from Kushta. And then they opened the books of this great Rabbi Yosef of Trani, and they realized that he passed away on the 14th of Tammuz, right, that year. So basically, after spending who knows how much researching to find his grave out there, it's basically in Sfat. So it's like a new grave, but it actually happens to be his. That's the dispute. It's time to move on. You want to visit 1889? Wonderful time for the Jews. Jews are returning to Eretz Yisrael. We're purchasing land. What happens? Do you rest on the land? What do you do? Shemittah comes. You're trying to buy into markets throughout the world. Are you going to put an end to it? Are you going to say, I'm sorry, I can't supply? Or is there a way out? So they turn to the greatest rabbinic authority in the world at the time, someone by the name of Rabbi Elchanan Spector. And Rabbi Elchanan analyzes the situation, and he notes that, listen, according to most authorities, Shemitah nowadays is midirabanan. And since it is only rabbinical, so therefore you could be lenient and rely on a sale, kehora'at sha'a. What is horat shah? So let's say, for example, you have a shul, right? And they rely on a leniency to have the first night of slichos before midnight, which is a leniency. So they don't want to make it permanent for eternity. So they know that it's only horat shah, which literally means an allowance for the time. We don't want to make it permanent, right? So this is what Rav Yitzchak Elchanan tells us. It isn't horat shah. Great rabbis in Jerusalem disagreed with him, by the way. Many, many great rabbis disagreed with him, but when you have someone like Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan giving an allowance in 1889, you don't argue. He was the great rabbinic authority. There are those that note that the circumstances and the situation by 1896 declined, that even those who were stricter became more lenient and allowed it kora'at shah. So there's absolutely no question that great rabbinic authorities relied on what we call heter mechira. It shouldn't be argued. It will be, but it shouldn't be argued. That is a fact. And that became the routine that people relied on it. The old yeshuv in Yerushalayim in general did not like it. And the year when all excitement broke loose was the Shemittah of 1910. The Shemittah of 1910 is a significant one because we have suddenly a heavyweight in Eretz Yisrael, the chief rabbi of Yafa, who is supporting and encouraging the Heter Mechira, a man that is very, very in tune with the farmers. And he knows that if we tell them to just forget it, stop working the land, they're going to ignore everything. So he creates, as a great rabbinic authority, he understands that it is the greatest mitzvah at this point to push the leniency. And he was shipping out documents to every single farmer for them to sign to allow the transfer of the land to non-Jews. And he gave them guidelines. What kind of works on the land should be done, should not be done, which one by Jews, which one by Gentiles. And this great rabbi of Yafa is Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. A towering figure. And he is, we could say, standardizing the Heter Mechira. The old yeshuv in Yerushalayim is extremely unhappy with it. Right? They are more traditional. They have a different outlook. For them, the concept of working the land was not part of their tradition. They viewed themselves more as part of an old settlement, Yishuv Hayashan. The relationship with the Yishuv HaChadash was problematic. And tension exists there. You know, for example, Baruch Kook, by the way, makes it clear in 1909 that when we are allowing it, we are seeking here to find an etzah, some kind of option, bitor hora'at sha'ah. He makes it very clear. I don't want this to be a long term. When necessary, use it. Now, workers and farmers were very upset after accepting it. And we are told, and lots of the information I have is because the way they got news out in those days was by placing on walls of Jerusalem these big posters, right, where they're crying against, terrible things that are done by others. And those posters are still actually, if you visit Mea Shearim, it seems to be that the stones are held up, right, by these posters. And there's a ton of information that you get as an historian from it. And Baruch Hashem, the Hebrew University has a collection from every single decade of scanned posters. And you could you could learn about all the fights that occurred during the 1909 issue, and it could continue. It's very, very fascinating. So lots of the information is by me sitting and reading these scanned documents from the Hebrew University. And, it talks about the fact that the farmers complain that these people from the old Yeshuv are ones that don't appreciate what we are doing, because they are anashim ha'chaim ala batala ha'atzlut. They are people who live off batala, meaning how does a farmer view a person who is from a member of the old Yeshuv? A batlan who does nothing, who's lazy, and ve'hakavtza